I didn't think much about the woman in the house next door when I first moved into the neighborhood. At least, not at first. The place I rented sat at the edge of a quiet street outside a small town in Oregon. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved when they drove past you, where most houses had porches and dogs and wind chimes that rang softly when the evening breeze came through the trees. After years of living in noisy cities, it felt like someone had finally turned the volume of the world down. My house was small, just one floor with a narrow garage attached to the side. The landlord told me the previous owner had built half the furniture himself, which probably explained why half the chairs leaned slightly to the left. I didn't mind. Fixing things had always been my way of relaxing. Most evenings after work, you could find me in the garage with the door open, a radio playing low somewhere behind me while I sanded wood or tightened loose bolts on some old piece of furniture someone in town had asked me to repair. And most evenings, my dog Buddy lay stretched out across the garage floor like he owned the place. Buddy was a mutt with too much energy and a habit of following me everywhere. If I stood up, he stood up. If I walked across the driveway, he trotted after me like a furry shadow. It didn't take long for the neighbors to notice us. The older couple across the street waved whenever they saw me. The mailman liked to stop and scratch Buddy behind the ears. And a kid 2 houses down once asked if I could fix the loose wheel on his skateboard. Small town stuff. Simple. Quiet. Exactly what I had been looking for. The house next door, though, was different. At first, I barely noticed it. The blinds were always down, and the driveway was usually empty. I figured the place belonged to someone who worked nights or maybe traveled a lot. But about 2 weeks after I moved in, I noticed something strange. It was late evening, just after sunset. I was in the garage sanding the arm of an old wooden chair someone from town had dropped off that morning. The radio was humming quietly behind me. Buddy was chewing on a tennis ball, and the smell of sawdust hung in the cool air. I leaned back to stretch my shoulders, and that's when I saw it. Across the yard, through the window of the house next door, the curtain moved, just slightly, enough for someone to peek through. At first I thought it was the wind, but then the curtain moved again, slowly, and for just a second, I saw the shape of someone standing behind it. A woman. She didn't step outside. She didn't wave. She just stood there, looking toward my garage. Then the curtain fell back into place. I shrugged and went back to sanding. It was a neighborhood, after all. People looked out their windows. That was normal. The second time I noticed her, it felt less normal. It happened a few nights later. I had taken Buddy out for a walk just after dinner. The sky had turned that deep blue color that comes right before night settles in, and the streetlights were starting to glow faintly along the road. Buddy stopped every few steps to sniff something invisible in the grass, which meant our walks took longer than they probably should have. As we came back down the street toward my house, I glanced toward the neighbor's window. The curtain moved again. This time I saw her more clearly. She stood perfectly still behind the glass, watching. Not the street, not Buddy, me. The moment my eyes met the window, the curtain snapped shut, like someone had yanked it closed. I slowed down without realizing it. Buddy tugged on the leash, impatient to get back to the house. All right, I muttered, letting him pull me along. Inside, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she was shy. Maybe she just didn't like being seen looking out the window. Some people were like that. Still, the next night, I found myself glancing over there again while I worked in the garage. The curtain moved. Same window, same silhouette, watching. A week passed like that. Every evening, sometime between sunset and midnight, I would catch a glimpse of her through the curtain. Always the same pattern. She would be there, standing, watching. And the moment she realized I noticed, the curtain would close. At first I wondered if she thought I was the strange one. From her perspective, she probably saw a guy in his garage every night, cutting wood and fixing broken chairs, while a hyperactive dog ran circles around the driveway. Maybe I looked like the weird neighbor. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. I set the wrench down on my workbench and stepped out of the garage, wiping my hands on a rag. The curtain across the yard shifted. I could see her shape behind it again. So I did the most normal thing I could think of. I raised my hand and waved. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the curtain dropped so fast, it actually startled me. I stood there a moment, hand still halfway in the air. Buddy barked once like he was laughing at me. Well, I muttered, lowering my hand. That went great. After that, I tried not to look too often. If someone wanted privacy, they deserved it. Still, it was hard not to notice. Because once you realize someone might be watching you, you start seeing it everywhere. a shadow moving behind the glass, a curtain shifting, a light turning off the moment you glance over. Most nights I convinced myself I was imagining things, but sometimes, when the garage lights reflected faintly off the window next door, I could swear I saw her standing there again, perfectly still, like she had been there for a long time, waiting, watching, and if I'm being honest, after a while, the strangest part wasn't that she was looking through the window. It was the feeling that she wasn't just curious about the neighborhood. It felt like she was waiting for something, or someone, and somehow, that someone was me. A few days passed, and eventually the strange little routine between me and the house next door became normal. Or at least normal enough that I stopped thinking about it every hour. Life settled into its usual rhythm. Wake up early, coffee strong enough to wake the dead, drive into town for work. I mostly did small carpentry jobs, fixing decks, repairing broken doors, building shelves for people who had watched too many home improvement shows and decided they suddenly needed custom furniture. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work, and when the day ended, I always looked forward to the quiet of the house again. Evenings were my favorite. The sun would dip behind the hills, the air would cool down, and I'd roll open the garage door while Buddy sprinted out into the yard like he'd been waiting all day for freedom. That garage slowly turned into my favorite place in the house. The smell of wood, the low buzz of tools, the soft hum of the radio, it felt like peace. And sometimes, without meaning to, I'd glance toward the window next door. Some nights the curtain didn't move at all. Other nights, just when I was about to forget about it, it would shift slightly, just enough to remind me she was still there, watching. I didn't try waving again after the first awkward attempt. Some people needed space, and whoever my neighbor was, she clearly preferred staying invisible. Still, there were little things that made her presence impossible to ignore. For example, she never came outside, not once. In most neighborhoods, you eventually see people mowing the lawn, checking the mail, bringing groceries inside. But with that house, nothing. The grass was trimmed, which meant someone must have been maintaining it. Lights turned on inside at night. Sometimes a soft glow from a television flickered across the window, but the door never opened, and no one ever stepped outside. One evening, about a month after I moved in, I was repairing a loose hinge on my back gate. Buddy had discovered a small hole under the fence and had apparently decided that the neighbor's yard was now part of his personal territory. I crouched down with a screwdriver and tightened the last screw. When I stood up, I instinctively looked toward the house next door. The curtain was already open, just slightly, and this time I saw her clearly. She wasn't old, maybe late 30s, early 40s, dark hair tied loosely behind her head. Her face looked pale in the dim light of the room behind her. But what stood out most was the expression. Not angry, not suspicious, just quiet, like someone observing the world from behind glass. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. Then she realized I was looking. The curtain closed again. I shook my head, half amused. "Buddy," I said, scratching behind his ears. "I think our neighbor might think we're the weird ones." Buddy wagged his tail like he agreed. That night, while I cooked dinner, I caught myself thinking about her again. Not in a creepy way, just curiosity. It's strange living next to someone you've never spoken to. Your mind fills in the blanks. Maybe she worked from home. Maybe she had social anxiety. Maybe she had gone through something hard and just wanted to be left alone. Everyone had a story. Some people just kept theirs locked inside. A few days later, something happened that made the situation even stranger. I had just come back from a long job outside town. It was late afternoon, the sky starting to turn orange near the horizon. Buddy burst out of the house the moment I opened the door, racing across the yard like he had unfinished business with every squirrel in Oregon. I grabbed a cold beer from the fridge and stepped out onto the small porch. The evening air felt good after a long day of work. For a while, I just stood there, listening to the quiet. Then Buddy barked. Not the playful bark he used when chasing leaves. This one was different. Alert. I followed his gaze. He was staring straight at the neighbor's house. The curtain was open again, and this time, the woman didn't close it. She was just standing there, watching Buddy run in circles. I raised my beer slightly in a casual half wave. She didn't wave back, but she didn't disappear either. She just stood there for another moment, then slowly stepped back. The curtain fell closed again. I laughed softly to myself. Progress, I muttered. Even if it was a strange kind of progress. A few weeks later, something happened that would change everything. It started on a rainy Thursday evening, the kind of steady rain that turns the whole world gray and quiet. I had spent most of the afternoon finishing a repair job for a family in town, and by the time I got home, the rain had already soaked the driveway. Buddy didn't mind. He loved rain. The moment I opened the garage, he ran straight into the yard, like he had discovered the greatest playground on earth. I rolled up my sleeves and started working on a small wooden cabinet someone had asked me to fix. Rain drummed softly against the roof of the garage. The radio played an old country song somewhere behind me, and for a while, everything felt perfectly normal, until my foot slipped. The concrete floor had gotten slick near the entrance, where rainwater had blown inside. I stepped backward to grab a clamp from the workbench. My heel hit the wet spot, and suddenly the world tilted. I lost my balance and crashed hard onto the garage floor. The impact knocked the air straight out of my lungs. For a second, I just lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to remember how breathing worked. Buddy rushed over immediately, licking my face like I had just performed the most exciting trick he'd ever seen. Yeah, I'm okay, I muttered, pushing myself up. My shoulder ached, but nothing seemed broken. I brushed the dust and water off my jeans and stood up again. Just another clumsy moment. No big deal. I grabbed a towel and wiped the wet patch on the floor. Then I went back to working on the cabinet like nothing had happened. What I didn't realize was that someone had been watching the whole thing, through the window, from the house next door. I didn't know she had seen me fall, at least not until later. That night, after I wiped up the water on the garage floor, I finished fixing the cabinet and carried it inside. My shoulder was sore, but it felt like the kind of soreness you get from lifting something wrong, nothing serious. I took a quick shower, fed Buddy, and settled onto the couch with a late dinner. The rain kept falling outside, steady and quiet. It was the kind of rain that made the whole neighborhood feel like it had gone to sleep early. By 11, the house was silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. Buddy was curled up on the floor near the couch, snoring softly. I was halfway through a random documentary when I started feeling the ache in my shoulder a little more. Nothing dramatic, just enough to remind me that concrete floors and gravity don't mix very well. I stretched my arm carefully and leaned back against the couch. The rain tapped against the windows, and that's when I heard it. 3 soft knocks on the door. Knock, knock, knock. At first I thought I imagined it. It was almost midnight. No one ever came by that late. Buddy lifted his head instantly. His ears perked up. Another knock followed, this one a little firmer. I stood up slowly, my shoulder protesting as I moved. "All right," I muttered, walking toward the door. Buddy trotted behind me. When I opened it, the cold night air rushed inside. And there she was, standing on the porch. For a moment my brain struggled to catch up, because for weeks she had only existed as a shadow behind a curtain. Now she was right in front of me. She looked smaller than I expected. Rain had soaked through her dark sweater, and strands of her hair clung to her face. Her arms were wrapped around herself like she had stepped outside without thinking about the weather. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then she said quietly, "I'm sorry. I know this is strange." Her voice was soft, nervous, like someone who almost turned around 100 times before knocking. "It's okay," I said, still surprised. "Is everything all right?" She hesitated, glancing briefly toward the garage. "I saw you fall earlier." I blinked. "You saw that?" She nodded. "Through the window." Her voice carried a hint of guilt. "I wasn't trying to watch you. I just happened to be there." For a moment I didn't know what to say. So many weeks of silent glances through a curtain, and the first real conversation started with my most embarrassing moment. I rubbed the back of my neck. "Yeah, that wasn't exactly graceful." A faint smile flickered across her face, but it disappeared quickly. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "I'm okay," I said, "just a bruised ego." She looked relieved, but she didn't move. Rain continued falling behind her, dripping off the edge of the porch roof. "You should probably come inside," I said finally. "You're getting soaked." She hesitated, like stepping across the doorway required more courage than knocking. Then she nodded slightly and stepped in. Buddy immediately trotted forward to inspect the situation. He sniffed her shoes, her coat, then wagged his tail like he had already decided she was acceptable. "He's friendly," I said. She crouched down slowly and held out her hand. Buddy sniffed it once and immediately leaned into her like they had known each other for years. She laughed softly. The sound surprised me. It was the first relaxed thing I'd seen from her. "What's his name?" she asked. "Buddy." "That fits." She scratched behind his ears while he wagged his tail like a helicopter. For a moment, the tension in the room softened. I walked into the kitchen. "Do you want some tea or something warm?" I asked. "That would be nice," she said quietly. While the kettle heated on the stove, she stood near the doorway, looking around the house. Not in a judgmental way, more like someone taking in a place carefully. Her eyes paused on the wooden shelves near the wall. "You built those," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," I replied. "Helps keep me busy." She nodded slowly. The kettle started to whistle. I poured 2 mugs and handed one to her. She wrapped her hands around it immediately, like she had been cold for a long time. For a while, we just stood there in silence. The rain tapping on the windows filled the room. Finally, she looked up at me. "There's something I should tell you." Her voice was different now, more serious. I leaned against the counter. "Okay." She took a breath. Then she said something I wasn't expecting at all. "I've been watching you." The words hung in the air. She quickly added, "I know that sounds creepy." I laughed softly. "Well, I had a suspicion." Her cheeks turned slightly red. "I'm sorry." I shook my head. "It's fine. Honestly, I thought maybe you just didn't like neighbors." "That's not it," she said. Then she looked down at the tea in her hands. Her fingers tightened slightly around the mug. "I watch because—" She paused. The silence stretched long enough that I thought she might change her mind. But then she looked up again and said something that made the room suddenly feel very quiet. "Because you remind me of someone." I frowned slightly. "Someone?" She nodded. "My son?" For a moment I didn't respond. She continued quietly. "His name was Noah." Something in her voice shifted when she said it. Not dramatic, just heavy, like the name carried weight she had been holding for a long time. "What happened to him?" I asked gently. She stared at the floor for a moment, then said the words that changed everything. "He died." The rain outside seemed louder suddenly. She swallowed. "It was 3 years ago." And just like that, I realized this strange, quiet woman next door had been carrying a story far bigger than the shadow behind a curtain. But what I didn't know yet was that the story somehow involved me. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The rain continued tapping softly against the windows, and somewhere behind us, the kitchen clock ticked steadily, like it was measuring the silence between her words. "My son," she repeated quietly. "His name was Noah." She stared into the mug of tea in her hands like she could see something inside it that I couldn't. I didn't rush her. Some stories need space before they come out. After a moment, she took a slow breath. "Noah loved building things," she said. Her voice softened slightly when she spoke his name. "He used to spend hours in our garage working on old furniture, broken bikes, anything he could get his hands on." She glanced toward the shelves along my wall. "The first time I saw you out there in your garage, sanding wood with that radio playing," her eyes moved briefly toward the hallway that led to my garage. "I thought I was imagining it." I leaned back against the counter, listening. "He moved the same way you do," she continued. "Focused, quiet, like the whole world disappears when you're fixing something." She paused. "And your dog." Buddy lifted his head at the sound of her voice. "Noah had a dog too," she said. "Big Mutt. Found him wandering on the side of the road when he was 16. A small smile touched her face. "He insisted on keeping him, even though I told him we couldn't afford vet bills." Buddy wagged his tail slightly, as if he understood he had been included in the story. "What happened to Noah?" I asked gently. Her smile faded. She took another slow breath. "Car accident." 2 simple words. But the way she said them made them sound heavy. 3 years ago, she added. I didn't interrupt. She continued slowly. "He was driving home from work. It was raining. Just like tonight." Her fingers tightened around the mug. A truck ran a red light. The room felt quieter somehow. "Noah was 22, she said. For a moment she looked toward the floor, blinking slowly like she was keeping something under control. "I don't remember much from the months after that," she admitted. "Everything felt empty." I nodded slightly. "Grief has a way of hollowing out time. Friends stopped visiting after a while," she continued. "People don't know what to say to someone who lost their child." She let out a soft breath. "So eventually, everyone just stopped saying anything." Her eyes moved slowly around my kitchen again. "I stopped leaving the house much." Her voice wasn't dramatic, just honest. "I stayed inside, watched the street, watched people living normal lives." Another pause. "And then one evening, I saw you." She gestured faintly toward the garage again. "You were working out there, talking to your dog like he understood every word." I chuckled quietly. "He probably understands more than most people." Buddy thumped his tail against the floor. For the first time since she arrived, the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. "You looked peaceful," she said, "like someone who had built a life that made sense." She shook her head softly. I hadn't seen that in a long time. I didn't know how to respond to that. So I just listened. At first I only watched for a few seconds, she admitted. But the next night you were there again. And the night after that. Her eyes lifted toward mine. Eventually, it became a routine. That explained the curtain, the quiet watching, the sudden disappearances. When she realized I noticed, I wasn't trying to spy on you, she said quickly. She searched for the right word. It made the house feel less empty. Her honesty surprised me. A lot of people would have tried to soften the story. She didn't. She just told the truth. I nodded slowly. I get that, I said. For a moment we stood there in comfortable silence. Then she said something that shifted the entire conversation. But that's not the real reason I watch you. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? She looked down again, thinking. Then she set the mug carefully on the counter. There's something else, she said. Her voice had changed again. More serious. More careful. Something you don't remember. That sentence caught my attention immediately. I don't remember? I repeated. She nodded. 3 years ago, a few weeks after Noah died. Her eyes lifted toward me again. I was standing on the old bridge outside town. Something in my chest shifted. The bridge she meant was the one on the road that ran just outside the valley. Most people passed it without thinking twice. She continued quietly. It was late, cold. Her hands trembled slightly now. I had been standing there for a long time. I felt my stomach tighten. Emma, I said slowly. She nodded slightly. Yes, Emma. She hadn't introduced herself until now. Emma, I repeated. Then I asked the question I already knew the answer to. Why were you on that bridge? She looked at me, and for the first time since she arrived at my door, her eyes filled with tears, because I didn't want to live anymore. The words landed heavily in the room. She continued softly. I stood there for almost an hour. Cars passed sometimes. Nobody stopped. Her voice cracked slightly. Then one car slowed down. My chest tightened. The memory was still foggy, but something about her story felt familiar. Someone got out, she said, walked over to the railing. I searched my memory. Rain. A dark road. A figure standing near the edge of the bridge. Emma continued. He didn't ask me what I was doing. He didn't panic. Her voice softened. He just started talking. I suddenly remembered. A cold night. Stopping because someone looked like they might need help. I thought you were lost, I said slowly. Emma nodded. You asked if I needed directions. I rubbed my forehead. Yeah, I remember that now. Back then I had simply assumed she was someone having a bad night. I never realized how close she had been to the edge. You talked to me for 10 minutes, she said, about nothing important. Her voice grew softer. Your dog. Your work. How small towns are boring, but peaceful. I remembered laughing, trying to make conversation because the situation felt awkward. Then she said the sentence that made my chest feel tight. You treated me like I was just a normal person standing on a bridge. She swallowed, and eventually, I stepped away from the railing. The rain outside the house seemed to grow louder again. Emma looked at me with quiet intensity. You don't remember saving me. But you did. Silence filled the room, and suddenly all those nights of a curtain shifting in the window next door made sense. She hadn't just been watching a neighbor. She had been watching the person who unknowingly gave her a reason to stay alive. For a long moment after Emma said that, I couldn't think of a single thing to say. Not because I didn't want to respond, but because my brain was trying to rearrange a memory that suddenly meant something very different. I remembered the night on the bridge now. It had been late, cold. The road was almost empty. I had been driving home from a long job outside town when I saw someone standing near the railing. At the time, nothing about it screamed emergency. People stop on bridges all the time, but something about the way she stood there, still, staring down into the darkness below, had made me slow down. I remembered pulling the truck over, stepping out, walking up beside her without making a big deal out of it. I hadn't asked, "Are you okay?" I hadn't said anything dramatic. I had just leaned on the railing beside her and said something stupid like, "Beautiful view from here, huh?" Emma gave a small, shaky laugh now. "That's exactly what you said." I rubbed my face slowly. Back then, I thought I was just filling an awkward silence. She continued quietly. "You talked about your dog, about how he steals socks." Buddy thumped his tail against the floor at the sound of his name. I shook my head. "I can't believe you remember all that." "I remember every word," she said softly. Her eyes dropped to the floor. "I was waiting for you to ask the question." "What question?" "If I was okay." She paused. "If you had asked that, I probably would have lied." I leaned against the counter, absorbing that. "But you didn't," she said. "You just kept talking." She smiled faintly through the sadness. You complained about gas prices. You told me the diner in town had terrible coffee. And at one point you said, she looked up at me again. Some days are awful, but tomorrow might be less awful. I frowned slightly. I say things like that all the time. Emma nodded. I know, but that night, those words mattered. Her voice grew quieter. Because for the first time in weeks, someone spoke to me like the future still existed. The room fell silent again. I didn't feel like someone who had saved a life. I felt like someone who had accidentally been standing in the right place at the right time. Emma continued slowly. After a few minutes, you checked the time. You said you had to get home before your dog destroyed the couch. I chuckled. That sounds like him. Then her voice softened. But before you left, you said something else. I tried to remember, but the details were fuzzy. Emma finished the sentence for me. You said, take care of yourself tonight, all right? I remembered that now. Just a casual goodbye. At least that's what I thought it was. Emma's eyes filled with quiet emotion. After you drove away, I stayed on the bridge for another minute. Her fingers trembled slightly around the mug. Then I stepped back. The weight of those words settled into the room. For a long time I didn't tell anyone about that night, she said, because it felt strange, like something small had changed everything. She looked at me again. You didn't know what was happening. You weren't trying to save me, but somehow you did. I exhaled slowly. I'm glad I stopped. Emma nodded. So am I. Buddy wandered over and rested his head gently against her knee. She scratched behind his ears automatically. He would have liked you, she said suddenly. Who? Noah. Her voice softened again. He always liked people who built things. I glanced toward the shelves along the wall. Well, I guess that's one thing we would have had in common. Emma watched Buddy for a moment. Then she said quietly, after that night, I tried to keep going, day by day. Her eyes lifted toward me again, but the house still felt empty. I didn't leave much. I didn't talk to anyone. She gave a small, embarrassed smile. And then one evening, you moved in next door. I laughed softly. So all those nights, she nodded. I wasn't spying. I was reminding myself. Of what? That life keeps happening. Her voice was steady now. Watching you fix things, hearing your dog bark, seeing the garage light on late at night. She looked around the room. It made the world feel normal again. I didn't know what to say to that. So I said the only honest thing I could think of. You don't have to watch from the window anymore. Emma looked surprised. You don't mind? I shook my head. Neighbors usually talk to each other. She laughed quietly at that. The first genuine laugh I'd heard from her. I guess I forgot that. For a moment we stood there in the kitchen, the rain still falling outside. Then Emma glanced toward the door. I should probably go. You can stay a little longer if you want, I said. She shook her head gently. I think tonight was enough courage for one evening. Buddy followed her toward the door like a loyal escort. Before stepping outside, she paused, then turned back toward me. Ryan. Yeah? Her voice softened again. Thank you. For tonight? 3 years ago. She stepped out into the rain before I could say anything else. I watched her walk across the yard toward her house. For the first time since I had moved in, the curtain next door stayed open. And when she reached her door, she turned and waved. After Emma walked back across the yard that night, the rain slowly began to fade. The quiet returned to the neighborhood, but something about the street felt different now. For weeks, the house next door had been a mystery, just a shadow behind a curtain, a pair of eyes watching from the dark. Now it wasn't a mystery anymore. Now it was just Emma, and that changed everything. Buddy stayed by the door for a while after she left, staring at the window like he expected her to come back. When she finally turned off the light inside her house, he let out a small sigh and returned to his spot near the couch. I didn't sleep much that night, not because anything was wrong, but because my mind kept replaying the story she had told me. The bridge, the rain, the 10-minute conversation I barely remembered. It's strange realizing that something small you did once, something you never thought about again, meant everything to someone else. Most of us move through the world assuming our actions don't matter much, but sometimes they do, more than we'll ever know. The next morning, the rain had cleared. Sunlight slipped through the kitchen window, lighting up the dust floating in the air. Buddy woke me up the way he always did, by dropping a tennis ball directly on my face. Yeah, I groaned, rolling out of bed. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and leaned against the porch railing. The street looked the same as always, quiet, peaceful. But a few minutes later, something happened that hadn't happened once since I moved there. The door of the house next door opened. Emma stepped outside. For a moment, she just stood there on the porch, like someone adjusting to sunlight after being indoors too long. Then she noticed me, and for the first time, she didn't disappear. She lifted a hand and waved. I waved back. Buddy barked happily like he had just witnessed the most exciting moment in neighborhood history. Emma laughed. It was a different laugh than the one from the night before. Lighter, like something heavy had shifted. "Morning," she called across the yard. Her voice carried easily in the quiet street. "Morning," I replied. Buddy sprinted across the grass immediately, tail wagging like he had been waiting his whole life for this moment. Emma crouched down just in time for him to crash into her arms. "I think he remembers me," she said, scratching behind his ears. "He remembers anyone who gives him attention," I said. She smiled. For a moment, we just stood there in the sunlight. Two neighbors. Nothing mysterious about it anymore. "I haven't been outside much," she admitted. I noticed. She looked slightly embarrassed. "I guess I got used to watching life through the window." "Well," I said, taking a sip of coffee, "it's not a bad street to actually be part of." She looked around slowly. The quiet houses, the trees, the morning light. I think I forgot that. Over the next few weeks, things began to change in small ways. Nothing dramatic, just little things. Emma started stepping outside more often. Sometimes she would sit on her porch in the evening while I worked in the garage. Other times she would walk down to the mailbox and back. The first time she walked down the street with Buddy and me, she laughed nervously like someone learning how to ride a bike again. But the more she did it, the easier it became. One afternoon, she knocked on my door again. Not in the middle of the night this time. Middle of the day. She held a small cardboard box. "I found something in the garage," she said. Inside the box were a few old tools. A worn hammer. Some rusted screwdrivers. "This was Noah's," she said. Her voice was steady. "He used them all the time." She held the hammer carefully. I thought, maybe you could use them. I looked at the tools for a moment, then back at her. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I think he would have liked that." So the tools moved into my garage. And every once in a while, when I picked up that hammer, I thought about the boy I had never met, and the strange way our lives had crossed paths anyway. One evening a few months later, Emma stood in my garage doorway while I finished repairing a wooden chair. The radio played softly in the background. Buddy slept near the workbench. Emma watched quietly for a while. Then she said something that stuck with me. "You know something strange?" "What's that?" I asked. She leaned against the doorframe. "For years I thought that night on the bridge was the most important moment of my life." I paused my work and looked up. "But now," she continued, "I think the more important moment was the next day." "The next day?" She nodded. "When I decided to wake up again." I thought about that for a second. Then I smiled. "Turns out tomorrow really can be less awful." Emma laughed, and that laugh echoed softly through the garage. Later that night, after she walked back to her house, I turned off the lights in the garage and stood for a moment in the quiet yard. The window next door was open, not hidden behind a curtain anymore, just a normal window with warm light inside. Buddy sat beside me, looking up like he was waiting for a walk. I scratched behind his ears. "You know," I said quietly, "sometimes we think we're just passing through someone's life." Buddy wagged his tail. "But to someone else." I glanced toward Emma's house. We might be the reason they decide to stay. And the strange thing is, most of the time, we'll never even know it.